Okay, in this video, I'm going to combine two topics. In fact, this is how I present these topics in class. We are going to do 3.2, causes and consequences of inflation and deflation, measure of inflation and deflation, CPI, and evaluate, with our wide topic, so it's going to probably take over 30 minutes. And 3.8, the quantity theory of money. It says quantitative, but it's the quantity theory of money and its interpretation by the monetarists. And I will include it when we talk about the causes of inflation, because you know that there are three main causes: demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, and an excessive increase in the money supply. Okay, let's go. It's going to take some time. Let me just tell you how we are going to organize these, how I'm going to organize these videos so you know where to look in information. I'll start by the definition: inflation, deflation, disinflation. I'll talk about the measurement of inflation and deflation, basically the CPI. Then I'll talk about the causes, including the quantity theory of money. And then we'll talk about the consequences of inflation. I'm not going to say too much about deflation because you just have to reverse everything that we say to find the consequences of deflation. I'll just say a few concluding remarks at the end. Okay, so part one, definitions. Inflation is when the average price level in the economy increases. So it's not just a single price. If the price of one item increases, you cannot really call that inflation. It's when on average the price level is higher, and that's a sustained increase, okay? Usually over several months, several quarters. The opposite of inflation is deflation. Deflation is when the price level falls. So on average, prices fall in the economy. Then there is another key term that you must know, which is disinflation. Disinflation is inflation at a lower rate. So the price level rises, but not as fast as before. Okay, so this is lower inflation basically. So for example, if last year, on average, prices had increased by 5%, and this year they have increased by 2%. So, well, in both years we've had inflation, the prices have increased on average, but you see that the rate at which prices have increased has decreased. It's a positive rate, it's an increase in prices, but it's a lower rate. That's what we call disinflation. The opposite of disinflation, which would be a situation where inflation becomes higher and higher, where prices increase faster and faster, is what we call accelerated inflation. Inflation accelerates, it becomes faster and faster. So that's really the first thing. You need to know those definitions. Maybe a fourth key term that you may want to use is the concept of hyperinflation, which is super high inflation. It's usually defined as a situation where prices increase by more than 50% every month. Okay, so it's as if you multiply prices by 1.5, at least 1.5 every month. Fortunately, it's a very rare situation. There are very few countries that have experienced hyperinflation. We can give the example of Germany, which was called the Weimar Republic in the 1920s after the First World War due to the Versailles Treaty. There was Argentina in the 1990s, but even more recently, Argentina is still struggling right now with inflation. There was Zimbabwe in 2008, 2009, who had like extremely high rates of inflation, hyperinflation. And more recently, Venezuela, since 2018, I believe, who is struggling with hyperinflation. So what do we call a high rate of inflation and a low rate of inflation? It's tough to tell, but basically we consider that anywhere below 3% is okay. Usually the central banks, they try to target a rate of inflation around 2%. So like anywhere below, like between 1 and 3%, we're good. Too close to zero is not really good either, because we are too close to deflation, and that's a bit risky. So usually we want to have a little bit of inflation, but not too much. So 1 to 3, it's perfect. Let's say 3 to 10, 3 to 8, it's a bit high, and that's roughly where we are right now. Not in Switzerland, but Switzerland somehow managed to keep inflation very relatively low compared to other European countries. But in most European countries, we had rates of inflation of around 6 to 7% last year, which is it starts to become significant. And then anywhere between, let's say, 10 and above 10%, we really start to have relatively high inflation. I'm talking about annual rates of inflation. More recently, you also have Turkey, who is experiencing rates of inflation that are over 50% per year. It's very hard to measure because the government has made it illegal to publish data on inflation. But the last data that was calculated was around 70%. So that's a lot, of course. All right, so that's good for the definitions. Now, the measurement. The measurement. So, usually, inflation is calculated by measuring the change in the price level. Okay, we calculate the percentage change in the price level. But then the question is, what is the price level and how do we measure the price level? Price level is measured using something that we call the Consumer Prices Index, CPI, Consumer Prices Index. There are several indexes, but we will focus on this one. In order to calculate the CPI at a given point in time, there are several steps that must be followed. It's important that you can explain those steps. Step 1. First, we need to know what people buy. So we're gonna start by surveying the population. Survey just to understand the consumption patterns of a typical household. So we take a typical, or we survey typical households, usually urban households. I think the household that are surveyed are like a typical family of 2 adults and 2 children. And not people who are not too rich, not too poor. We exclude those who have like a super high income or super low income, because we consider that they are not very representative of the majority of the population. And we simply ask them, all right, well, what do you guys buy? Like, how do you spend your money? And that allows us to make a list of the most typical items that people buy. So it's a list that has several hundreds of items. I forgot how many. I believe it's over 1,000 in Switzerland. I think it's 1,200, but I may be wrong. I think I wrote it in the lesson. You can check. So we have a long shopping list of like items that people buy. And of course, we also ask them information about how much they spend, like what proportion of their income they spend on every single item on that list. And this is important because, of course, when we measure inflation, we want to attach or to give more importance to items on which people spend a lot of money. Okay, so if the price of something on which we spend a lot of money increases by 10%, we want to give it a greater impact than if the price of something on which we spend very little increases by 10%. So surveying the population allows us to build this like shopping list, which we call a market basket, which is a hypothetical market. But for each item, we also attach a coefficient, a weight. We attach a weight, and of course, the sum of all those weights is equal to 100. Well, in fact, I think it's 10,000, but it doesn't matter. It's like when you calculate a weighted average. You assign a coefficient to each two show how important it is relative to the yen. So that's step one. You have your big shopping list. Step two, we are going to collect prices for each item. So again, I believe there are over 1,000 items on the list, and that's usually something that we do every month. So every month, for each and every item that is on that list, we have to collect or to calculate the average price for that item. So of course, we do not collect a random price for the item in the economy. We collect multiple prices. Again, I forgot, I calculated it, I told you. I believe I said 60, but I may be wrong. So for every item, we roughly, please double check, but if I'm right, we collect 60 different prices for the same item, right? But at different locations in the country, different types of stores. So we can, on internet as well. So we can calculate the average price for every single item. Step three, we calculate the weighted average. Weighted average. So the weighted average would be, for example, the price of item 1 times the weight of item 1 plus the price of item 2 times the weight of item 2, blah, 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 until the end. Okay, that's the definition of a weighted average. Once we have calculated this average, so it's going to be of a certain value, something like 10,000 francs. Because the prices are expressed in francs, we can have like a weighted average that basically is going to tell us, well, the weighted average of this market basket is 10,000 francs. Once we have done that for, let's say, 1 year, let's say this is in 2022, we do the same thing. Let's say this is in January 2022. We're going to do the same thing the next month, February 2022. The same thing. Usually we keep the same market basket. Okay, the market basket, we don't change it every month, of course. We may change it every couple of years. So we don't do step 1 every month, but we do step 2 every month. So the next month we collect new prices. And we calculate the new weighted average and say, oh, well, okay, so then in February 2022, it's, 10.5 thousand francs. So this was in 2020, in January, this is in February. Okay, but that's not very convenient for us to be able to calculate inflation. That's not a price index, it's just a weighted average. So that's not something that it's very convenient to work with. So what we're going to do is that we're going to convert these values into an index number. And guess what? This index number is what we call the CPI. So what we do now is that we choose a base year or base month, okay? Because I took the example of month, we pick a base month. Let's say that we take January 2022 as our base month, and remember that the value was 10,000 francs in January, and then in February it was 10.5. And then what we're going to do is that we're going to convert all of the amounts that we have into an index number. So the formula is simply equal to the index value is simply the value in month X, doesn't matter, any month, January, February, March, blah, 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 over the value in the base month times 100. I forgot, times 100. So, of course, if I convert this into an index number, okay, so the CPI for January 2022 is going to be the value in January 2022, so 10,000 francs, divided by the value in the base month, which is January, so that's the same, 10,000 francs, times 100. Oh, and guess what? We have 100. Yeah, during the base year or the base month, the index number is always equal to 100. But when we do that for February 2022, so it's the value in month X, so the value in February, which is 10.5 thousand francs divided by 10,000 francs times 100. And if I'm not wrong, it's equal to 105. Okay, these are the CPIs in January 2022, in February 2022, and that's usually much easier to work with. But careful, these are not francs, okay? They don't have any unit. It's just 100 and 105. And it's easier to work with, so of course I picked very simple numbers. So in fact, maybe you don't really see the point of converting that into index numbers because those values I picked were so easy. But sometimes the values can be very complicated. Imagine if the value in January was like 23,792.65, and the value, you see, so the value is very complicated. That makes it much more difficult to assess the extent to which prices have changed. But by converting into an index number, well, now that's super easy. Okay, so now to calculate the rate of inflation between January 2022 and February 2022, I simply have to look at the change in the index number and because it is standardized, it's just very easy to calculate the percentage change. From 100 to 105, well, prices have increased by 5%. And that is your rate of inflation month to month, okay? Right, so that's basically how we calculate inflation. This measure is not perfect, of course. Remember that it only represents the consumption patterns of an average household. It might not represent the average, consumption patterns of everyone. In particular, we usually exclude people on very high incomes, people on very low incomes. We focus on urban households. So the consumption patterns can differ for people who live in more rural areas. The consumption pattern, like I said, we don't update the market basket every month. We do that every 3 years. But consumption patterns, they may change in between, and therefore you might just before you revise your market basket, your calculations or your measures in inflation may not effectively reflect what people actually buy. Another problem that can occur when measuring inflation is that it doesn't really take into account the fact that people can replace certain items that have become more expensive by other items that have become relatively cheaper. So for example, if I say that, oh, well, there is a rate of inflation of 5%, so people have a lower, the living standards have decreased by 5%. Well, not necessarily, because imagine that in your market basket, if you have included, I'll try to find a good example. Let's say, okay, I'll take a silly example, right? Let's say you have included apples, but you have not included pears. And it's a silly example, but you'll understand my point. And oh, wow, we see that apples have increased by 10%. But in this case, a possibility of 50%. People can just replace apples by pears. And maybe so. So in fact, they will not be very much affected by the fact that the price of apples has increased. So when you will calculate the rate of inflation, you may find something very high, and you may be inclined to deduce that, oh, people have much lower living standards, but perhaps they have simply replaced those items that became super expensive by items that became less expensive. So basically, their consumption patterns change in response to price changes. So that's really something that any measure of inflation pretty much fails to capture. Another limitation of this measure of inflation is that usually each country has its own market basket, of course, because we want to because consumption patterns, they differ from one country to the other, but they also have their own methodology. There is unlike unemployment, where the International Labour Organization has set a very precise definition of unemployment, so you can actually compare from one country to the other. It's pretty difficult to compare rates of inflation across countries because, again, different market basket, different methods to measure it. There is one effort in the EU to calculate a harmonized, I think it's called the CPI-H, the HCPI, the H is for harmonized. They try to define a CPI that can be calculated in using the same methods across the EU, at least in terms of the methods. So that's one effort to make the rates of inflation more comparable between various countries. Okay, that's it about the measure of inflation. Now, causes. There are three main. I'll talk about a few more. The causes. What causes inflation? Number one, demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is inflation that is caused by an increase in AD. So, there is not much to explain, you just need to graph it. Careful when you label your axes. Let's just put real GDP or aggregate output to decide, and PL for price level. And don't bother, let's do the short-term monetarist model. So you have the short-term aggregate supply, you have your initial aggregate demand curve, Y star, Y1, let's just call it Y1, Y1, PL1. Okay, so this is our benchmark. And if you have an increase in AD, for example, if government spending increases, if the rate of interest decreases, there are many factors that can cause an increase in AD. AD is going to shift to the right. And you see that the price level is going to increase. Okay? An increase in the price level is precisely what we call inflation. That's it. What you can do, don't forget to give a few examples of what can cause an increase in AD, just like I did. The second cause of inflation is cost push inflation. Cost push inflation is inflation that is caused by a decrease in aggregate supply. Okay, there's not much to explain. Graph it. Real GDP, aggregate output, that's your price level, that's AD, that's your initial short-term aggregate supply. So you start from here, and then AS decreases. Again, give a few examples. Could be that the price of certain raw materials increases, the price of labor increases, could be that productivity decreases, that the government introduces more indirect taxes, you name it. But what matters is that you see that this decrease in SRAS has caused an increase in the price level, cost push inflation. Another cause of inflation, and that's where we're going to talk about the quantity theory of money, is the QTM, or at least it's the theory that it explains what can be the root cause of inflation. So the quantity theory of money is a theory that has been introduced by the monetarists. The monetarists, or monetarism, is a school of thought in economics. It's just a group of people who share similar ideas about economic theory. They are, for example, like there was some kind of a fight between the monetarists and the Keynesians because they had different views on what is the role of the government, what is the role of the central bank, what we should do when there is a crisis, and so on. So different groups of people, different schools of thought. Just remember one name, Keynes for Canadians. For monetarists, you can remember Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, which is an American economist, and it's basically the father of monetarism. And according to them, the key reason of inflation, or the main root cause of inflation, is an excessive increase in the money supply. Oh, well, we have inflation because the money supply increases too quickly. And they summarize the explanation, or they provide an explanation. Of course, we simplify it here, but their explanation is based on what we call the Fisher equation, which we also call the equation of exchange. The equation of exchange. And you know it, it's M times V is equal to P times Q, or Y, doesn't matter. I think Q makes more sense, but it doesn't matter. It's important to understand what it means. M is the money supply. It's the amount of money that is in circulation in the economy, the quantity of money. V is the velocity of money, or the velocity of circulation. It measures the number of times one unit of money, let's say one banknote, for example, to simplify, but it's true for any form of money. The number of times a banknote, for example, changes hands in an economy over a year. Okay, so for example, if the same banknotes has been spent 10 times, we have a velocity equal to 10. The velocity of money changes over time, but it changes very slowly. So in the short run, it's okay to take it as fixed. So the upper bar means that, yeah, that doesn't really change. P is the price level, so the average price. Economy. And Q is the output, the real output. So basically how much has been produced in the economy over a given period of time. So V is equal to P. And by the way, Q may or may not be regarded as fixed. Quite often it is regarded as fixed, but it doesn't really matter. I'll just give you a bit more details in a minute. So what do you think about this? Now let's try to analyze. M times V, it just measures how much money has been spent. So it's equal to the total spending in the economy. Because M is how much money we have, like the number of banknotes that we have, all right? And V is how many times each banknote has been used. So for example, if we have like 1,000 banknotes of $100, and if each banknote has been spent 10 times over the course of a year, then basically, so that's $100,000 of banknotes in total that have been spent 10 times each on average. So that means that overall we have spent $1 million. Okay, that's how much money has been spent overall in the economy over the course of a year. And P times Q, which is again sometimes also written P times Y, but let's just say PQ. Well, that's the total, that's the how much has been produced and sold, basically. Because this is the average price of an item, and that's the quantity that has been produced and sold. So it's the total value of output, which is also the total revenue from the perspective of businesses. Okay, I repeat, P is just the price of an item on average, and Q is how much has been produced and sold. So P times Q is how much money has been generated by the sales of these items. So that's the total revenue. And well, of course, from that perspective, you understand that, of course, in an economy, total spending is always equal to total revenue. Every time someone spends $1, This dollar is a dollar of revenue for someone, always. So this equation, which is almost a bit silly, just tells you that everything that is spent in the economy, spent by someone, is received by someone else. That's it. Now, if we rearrange it a bit, so we have MV, which is equal to PQ, which means that P is equal to M over Q times V. And remember that V is fixed. So that's the price level. Now remember, this does not change. So now the question is, when are we going to have inflation? Well, we're going to have inflation if the price level increases. Okay, that's the definition of having inflation. And if we assume that the velocity of circulation is constant, V does not change, the only situation where the price level can increase is if this ratio increases, if M over Q increases. So remember that M is the money supply and Q is how much we have produced. What it means essentially is that if the money supply increases faster than production, well, then we'll have inflation. Because of course, if M increases, if the numerator increases faster than the denominator, well, the ratio is going to increase. If M increases by 20% and Q increases only by 10%, well, we're going to have inflation. Which makes sense when you think about it. Imagine that the economy has increased production by 10%. Okay, we produce more, that's great. But at the same time, the money supply has increased by 20%. Well, prices will increase because yes, we do have more output in an economy. We have more goods and services in the economy. It's great, 10% more, but we have 20% more money. So of course, prices will increase. On the other hand, what it says is that you will not necessarily have inflation even if the money supply increases. But the condition is that, well, you need output to increase faster than the money supply. So for example, if output increases by 20% in the economy, so we have 20% more goods and services in the economy, and if the money supply increases only by 10%, well, in that case, according to this model, you will not have inflation, you would have deflation. And if the money supply increases at the same pace as output, so output increases by 10% and the money supply increases by 10%, so you have 10% more goods and services and you have 10% more money, while the price level remains the same in that case, right? In some textbooks, in some reference, they even say that Q is regarded as constant, because if you remember, in the long run, aggregate supply, sorry, according to the monetarist, is vertical, okay? Which means that according to the monetarist, we always produce the same output in the long run, so the output does not change. In that case, so what we did so far, if we consider that Q can change, that's basically the short run. Because in the short run, the output can change. If we are in the long run, however, the output is going to be the same, always the potential output YP. But in that case, if you have V that is constant and if you have Q that is constant, well, anytime you increase the money supply, this will necessarily increase the price level, okay? So when you present the equation of exchange, and if you ask yourself, okay, is Q fixed or does it change? You can say that in the short run, it can change, and then you can explain what I just did before. And then you can say, yeah, but in the long run, monetarists believe that the economy will always produce the potential level of output, so Q does not change in the long run. And therefore, since we have V, which is constant, and Q, which is constant, anytime the money supply increases, the price level will increase. So basically, according to the monetarist and according to the quantity theory of money, inflation is caused by an increase in the money supply. In the long run, any increase in the money supply will cause inflation. In the short run, an increase in the money supply will cause inflation only if the increase in the money supply is faster than the increase in output. Okay? Right. That's a long video. Okay. But it's a long topic, and chances are quite high that you will have such topics. Consequences. So again, we'll do consequences of inflation, and I'll say to conclude, I'll say a few words about deflation. Well, number one, fall in the real value of money. The real value of money is the purchasing power of money. And obviously, when you have inflation, each amount of money now has a lower purchasing power. That is the very first consequence. Consequence number two, workers on fixed incomes are made worse off. If your income is fixed, if it does not follow inflation, well, every month prices increase, but your income doesn't. And so every month your purchasing power falls. So it's bad news for you. Consequence number three, menu cost. Mostly relevant when inflation is very high. Okay, if you have like a low inflation, we don't really care. The menu cost is the cost of changing a listed price. It's only relevant or mostly relevant for firms who sell many products. And again, only when inflation is very high, because firms who sell many products and when prices change very quickly, it means that on a regular basis, let's say every week, every month, they have to calculate and display the new prices for hundreds of items. Which it's not necessarily easy. We have to calculate what the optimal new price should be. We might have to print new price tags, to update the website, to update the database, to print a new catalog. There are costs involved, like raw materials, but mostly staff. Okay, it can people, instead of just changing the price tags of hundreds of items, they could have done something else. So there is an opportunity cost. Something similar, the shoe leather cost. Again, only relevant when inflation is very, very high. So relevant when we have hyperinflation, for example. And this relates to the fall in the real value of money. If inflation is extremely high, the purchasing power of money will decrease very quickly. So basically, the consequence is that people do not want to hold on to money because it loses its value very quickly. It's like if it's burning, right? If you have a banknote that is burning. So what you want to do, you don't want to keep it. You want to convert it in something that will keep its value over time, something that is going to be a better store of value, because when inflation is very high, money is no longer a good store of value. So it could be gold, it could be other currencies, it could be interest-bearing assets like bank accounts that pay rates of that pay interest, so at least the interest payments you receive compensate to some extent the loss in purchasing power. So the point is that at any time you receive money, you will want to get rid of it. It's like a hot potato. You want to get rid of it as soon as you can. And imagine if you are a restaurant and people pay in cash. Well, as soon as they pay in cash, you may just want to go to the bank to just exchange the money for foreign currency, to buy gold, or to put the money on an interest-bearing account. And in some countries, when inflation was very high, the stores were actually paying people to just go from the restaurant to the bank several times a day, to just bring the cash from the restaurant to the bank to convert it into something that is going to keep its value over time. And so there are multiple trips from the restaurant to the bank, from the bank to the restaurant, and so on. And it just wears off the leather of the shoes. So that's why we call that a shoe leather cost. But as you can imagine, it's only when inflation is very high. Of course, it's an image. We understand what it means. It's a metaphor. It's not really about the leather of the shoes. It tends to be quite bad for it's bad for international trade. It's bad for international trade because if my products, if there is high inflation at home, in particular, if inflation at home is higher than inflation abroad, that makes my products less competitive. And because my products have become less competitive, then people will not buy my products anymore. So I will export less, I will import more because now foreign products have become relatively cheaper because everything is expensive at home. And therefore, exports going down, import going up, AD will decrease. You know that this is usually something that is bad for the economy. The only possible benefit is that it can reduce inflation. It's bad for investment. Well, for two reasons. Well, reason number one, because inflation creates uncertainty about future prices, especially if inflation is fluctuating. We don't really know what the rate of inflation will be in 2 years, in 3 years. That's why usually we consider that price stability is a good objective for an economy because it reduces uncertainty and stimulates long-term investments. When prices are no longer stable, well, everybody, is just adopting a wait and see approach. They just wait until the situation stabilizes and they postpone investment decisions, which again is quite bad because if investment decreases, this decreases AD, and again, this may have bad consequences on an economy. Is it the final consequence? Yeah. It's good for those who borrow, bad for those who lend. Especially, and you should mention it, it's important, especially when inflation is unexpected. Because I'll explain. Imagine, that's really something that you should explain. If you have something about inflation, don't forget to talk about that. Imagine that Constantino wants to borrow from Nastya. So Nastya lends 1,000 francs to Constantino. And he said, yeah, I'll pay you back next year. But Nastya say, well, you know what? In 2023, the rate of inflation in Switzerland was 2%. It's a bit more than that, but let's just say the rate of inflation was 2%. And so I expect that it's going to be the same. Why not? I expect that it's going to be the same in 2024. And because of that, I'm going to charge you a rate of interest of 2%. So at least you will give me an amount of money, you will pay back an amount of money that has the same purchasing power as the purchasing power of the money that I gave you. So for example, if we take a simple example where so the rate of interest is 2%, which means that next year Constantino will pay back 1,020 francs. To illustrate that, let's just take one item as an example, just to make it easier. Something that costs 20 francs, let's say a burger. Okay, that's beautiful burger, which is 20 francs. When Nastya lent Constantino 1,000 francs, it is as if she had lent him 50 burgers, right? That's the value of 1,000 francs. 20 francs was in 2023. But we expect that there will be a rate of inflation of 2%. So we expect that a burger will cost, so 1% is 0.2. So if I'm correct, we expect that one burger will be 20.4 francs in 2024. Okay, that would be plus 2%. Well, again, that's just assuming that the price of the burger will behave like the average prices in the economy. Okay, and if you calculate, Nastya charged a 2% rate of interest, and basically, if I didn't make a mistake, it's just double check because it's a bit late and I'm a bit tired. But with 1,020 francs, she should be able to purchase 50 burgers when the price is that. So let's do the math. So 1,020 divided by 20.4. Okay, 50. So that's 50 burgers. So that's fair, right? She lent Constantino the equivalent of 50 burgers, and 1 year later, he will pay back the equivalent of 50 burgers. So in that case, no problem. Nobody wins, nobody loses. But what if Nastya was wrong? In fact, inflation is not 2%, it's 4%. So there is a mistake. So instead of having a price that increases by 2%, everything in the economy increases by 4%, including the price of the burger, just for illustration. Well, in that case, so of course she did not see that coming, and she charged a rate of interest of 2%, so Constantino is going to pay back 1,020 francs. But of course, now that the prices are higher than expected in the economy, the purchasing power of 1,020 francs is not 50 burgers, but 1,020 divided by 20.8, 49.03. Let's just say 49. So in that case, when inflation is unexpectedly high, Nastya loses because she lent the equivalent of 50 burgers and she only gets back the equivalent of 49 burgers. Okay? It's a good news for Constantino. He borrowed 50 burgers, he only gives back 49. He's happy. But you see why it's only the case when inflation is higher than what we expected, because if it is exactly equal to what we expected, it doesn't really matter because we can charge the rate of interest that we want. Okay, of course it would work the other way around. If inflation is lower than expected, this would be good for Nastya and this would be bad for Constantino. But this example, I doubt you would have the time to present such an example if you have that in the examination, which is too bad. But if you feel like you have the time, that'd be amazing. But then make sure you explain it well. Okay, so these are the main consequences of inflation. Now, just to conclude, deflation. So we just have to reverse everything. The measure is exactly the same. Let's start with definition. When the price level goes down, the measure is exactly the same. We calculate the CPI, and we will say that deflation occurs when the CPI between 1 month and the other, or 1 year and the other, decreases. Okay, when you calculate the percentage change between the CPI in 2023 and 2024, and if you see that it went down, that's deflation. Causes. The same causes would be demand pull deflation. We already call it demand pull, but you see the idea, right? It can be caused by a decrease in AT. It can also be caused by the supply, the aggregate supply that increases. If you have an increase in aggregate supply, then the price level will fall. This really is the reverse from what we've done before. According to the quantitative theory of money, let's start with the long run, where V and Q are fixed. In that case, according to the quantitative theory of money, there will be deflation when the money supply decreases. Okay, in the short run, if we allow Q, the output, to vary, then you will have deflation if, write it down, if M over Q decreases. So M over Q can decrease, for example, if the money supply increases a little bit, but if the quantity produced increases much more, okay? For example, output increases by 50% and the money supply only increases by 10%. In that case, the ratio goes down and that will be deflation. Could also be that the money supply itself decreases, okay? The quantity produced is either constant or increases. Well, anytime this ratio goes down, there are several possibilities, then you will have deflation. The consequences are also reversed. The real value of money will increase, meaning that now each amount of money has now a greater purchasing power. Okay. Usually, okay, inflation can sometimes be super high. Deflation is never. You don't have hyperdeflation. Whenever you have deflation, it's always very close to zero. It's like negative 0.5%, maybe -1, -2. But it's never. I don't think there was any example of deflation that was like very severe. So menu cost, shoe leather cost really do not make much sense as a consequence of deflation. So just save that for inflation. Pretty good for international trade, because if prices decrease at home, that makes them more internationally competitive, okay? So we will export more and we will import less. So that's good for AD, because we net exports X minus M will increase, so AD will increase, which is something that can solve the problem of deflation if AD increases. Pretty bad for investment as well, same thing, because it creates instability, and firms don't really know what to expect, so they may wait until price stability is recovered, is achieved again before they can decide to make long-term investment decisions. And in terms of people who borrow and people who lend, well, same thing. If deflation is unexpected, in that case, it's going to benefit the lender. I'm not going to do the full example in the case of deflation, but if you want, you can practice. You can make a similar example where, let's say, we expect that there will not be any inflation. Okay, so Nastya expects that inflation will be 0%, so she charges no rate of interest. But then at the end of the year, prices have fallen by 2%. So you can do the same type of example, and you will see that in that case, the purchasing power, the real value of the amount that Nastya has lent to Constantino is in fact less than the real value of the amount that Constantino will pay back. So in that case, Nastya wins, and Nastya is the lender, and Constantino loses the borrower. Okay, so remember, inflation, good for people who borrow, especially if it is unexpected. Deflation, bad for people who lend, especially if it is unexpected. I realized that I forgot a little detail among the causes of inflation, which is something that we call imported inflation. Imported inflation. Just check my notes on that. Imported inflation, because I think there was something else, if you remember. Imported inflation is basically when the price of certain resources, mostly resources that we import, like resources we are dependent on, like oil, for example. If suddenly the world price of oil increases very much and we still have to import oil and other resources whose price may have increased, this leads to an increase in our domestic cost of production, and then ultimately this leads to cost push inflation. So basically, imported inflation is linked to cost push inflation, something that can trigger a cost push inflation. Of course, a cost push inflation can be caused by many things. It could be just that wages are increased, that productivity goes down. There are many factors that can decrease AS, but one of them is that imported raw materials have become much more expensive. So this is something that we call imported inflation. Could also be the exchange rate. Could be a situation where your currency has very much depreciated. And because it has depreciated, it becomes more expensive, okay, to buy foreign goods and services. And this is something that can translate into a higher cost of production and therefore leading to cost push inflation. I'm just looking at my notes. I don't think I have forgotten anything. Yeah, looks pretty good. Oh yeah, something about deflation. Sorry, it's a bit messy. Something really bad about inflation, I forgot to mention it, is that when prices fall, people don't want to buy now, they want to wait because they see that month after month prices go down. So they just want to save. They want to save and they hold on to their money. And they just defer, they postpone their consumption or investment decisions, doesn't matter, because they expect that things will become cheaper the more they wait. And that just makes the problem worse, because it means that, let's just focus on consumers. Consumers expect that prices will fall, so they consume less today. And so AD decreases, and as AD decreases, the price level decreases even more. So that just leads to a situation where prices keep falling. So people keep waiting, so consumption falls even more, and so on and so on. This creates some kind of a vicious cycle where deflation leads to more deflation as consumers postpone their consumption of their purchases of consumer goods. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. It's been a long video already, but you now have everything you need to know about inflation, and it's such an important topic. So make sure that you feel comfortable with everything that I have explained in this video.